The Pacific Ocean, 1943. The morning horizon burns orange against the dark blue sea. Below, the deck of the USS Yorktown CV-10 trembles as engines roar to life. Salted wind tears across the flight line, whipping at the canvas helmets of young men, pilots barely in their 20s, strapping into something no one has yet seen in combat. The aircraft before them is different, bigger, broader, a beast of folded wings and iron skin, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It's not elegant like the Zero, it's heavy, industrial, born from rivets, steel, and American factories that never sleep. The launch officer gives the signal. A single hand slice when the first Hellcat hurtles forward, engine screaming at full power. The deck drops away. The Pacific rushes beneath. Moments later, far ahead in the sky, a formation of Japanese Zeros arcs in from the east, glinting silver in the sun. They see the silhouette climbing to meet them, but it's not the Wildcat they remember. It's something larger, faster, unflinching. What happens next will rewrite the balance of air power in the Pacific. Because the fighter rising to meet them isn't just another American plane. It's the machine that will end Japan's aerial supremacy. It's the day the Zero meets its nemesis, the F6F Hellcat. The story of the F6F Hellcat begins not with triumph, but with fear. In the early months of 1942, the Pacific skies belonged to Japan. The Mitsubishi A6M0, sleek and almost impossibly agile, carved through Allied formations like a hawk among doves. Its range, maneuverability, and climb rate stunned American pilots who had never faced anything like it. The Zero's thin armor and light frame made it fragile, but in the hands of Japan's highly trained naval aviators, it was a weapon of dominance. At Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines, the Zero seemed unstoppable. U.S. pilots flying F4F Wildcats, rugged but underpowered, found themselves outturned, outclimbed, and outgunned. In the first 6 months of the war, Japan's carrier-based air power appeared near invincible. Each engagement brought home the same message. America needed a better fighter, and it needed it fast. By 1942, Japanese naval aviation stood at its peak. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the 1930s mastering carrier warfare, a discipline still in its infancy in much of the world. Their pilots were veterans of years of conflict in China. Their tactics were precise, honed, and confident. The A6M0, designed by Jiro Horikoshi, symbolized this mastery. Introduced in 1940, it combined long range with incredible agility. Its engine, the Nakajima Sake, wasn't the most powerful, but the aircraft's light construction compensated for it. The Zero could outturn nearly anything in the sky. Its performance shocked Western observers. At the time of its debut, few American or British fighters could match its range of over 100 miles, a capability that allowed Japanese carriers to strike from unprecedented distances. The Allies nicknamed it the Zeke, but to every pilot who faced it, it was simply the Zero, a ghostly adversary that seemed to defy physics. Lessons from defeat. The United States Navy, reeling from the early blows of 1941 and 1942, began to study the Zero in every way possible. Reports from pilots who survived encounters painted the same picture. Turning with a Zero was suicide. Diving away offered the only chance. When a Zero crashed in the Aleutian Islands in June 1942, intact enough to be studied, engineers and tacticians finally had the key they needed. They examined its design closely, noting its strengths but also its fragility. The aircraft had no armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was deadly in skilled hands, but it couldn't take punishment. The U.S. Navy's conclusion was clear. To defeat the Zero, they didn't need to outturn it. They needed to outlast it. The search for a successor at the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, engineers were already working on an upgrade to the F4F Wildcat. The project was originally meant to be a modest evolution, a slightly faster, more powerful version. But the realities of war changed everything. Leroy Grumman, founder of the company, and his chief engineer, William Schwendler, received urgent requests from the Navy. Build a fighter that could match the Zero in performance and exceed it in durability. Grumman's design philosophy was simple: reliability before elegance. He believed in aircraft that could absorb damage and bring their pilots home. His planes were sometimes called Grumman Ironworks creations, known for their toughness. That toughness would become the cornerstone of the new design. The new aircraft would need to launch from carrier decks, operate over vast ocean distances, and still carry enough firepower to bring down enemy bombers and fighters alike. In June 1942, as the Battle of Midway raged across the Pacific, Grumman's engineers were already testing the prototype that would become the F6F Hellcat. Midway, the turning tide, while the Hellcat was still on drawing boards, another battle was changing the war's course. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 ended Japan's string of unchecked victories. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a single day. Yet victory came at a cost. The U.S. Navy's fighter squadrons suffered heavy losses, and those who survived returned with sobering reports. The Wildcat was obsolete. Even the lessons of Midway couldn't disguise the need for new machines. The Navy now knew 2 truths. Japan's carrier force could be beaten, and a new generation of aircraft would be the tool to finish the job. That sense of urgency flowed straight into Grumman's workshops. The prototype takes shape. The first XF6F1 prototype rolled out in June 1942. At first, it was powered by the Wright R2600 engine, 2,700 horsepower. But flight tests revealed it wasn't enough. Test pilot Robert Hall and Navy evaluators wanted more power. Grumman made a bold move. They swapped the engine for the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower monster already powering the F4U Corsair. The change transformed the aircraft. Now, the Hellcat had speed on and over 370 miles per hour, and a climb rate that could challenge the Zero. More importantly, it retained Grumman's trademark toughness. Armor plating protected the cockpit and fuel tanks. Self-sealing systems prevented catastrophic fires. Its wide landing gear made carrier landings safer. Even for inexperienced pilots, the Navy immediately saw potential. The Pacific awaits as 1943 began. Production of the Hellcat accelerated at a pace that only American industry could sustain. Factories in Bethpage worked around the clock. Every bolt, every rivet was part of a larger machine. Not the aircraft itself, but the vast industrial network behind it. For Japan, this was something they could not match. The Zero had been designed in an era of precision craftsmanship, hand-built, lightweight, and refined. But as war demands grew, Japanese industry struggled to keep up. By contrast, American production lines were mechanized and endless. For every Zero Japan produced, the United States built several Hellcats. And every month, the number grew. By the summer of 1943, the first operational squadrons were ready. Navy Fighter Squadron 9 VF-9, operating from the USS Essex, received their new aircraft. Pilots trained hard, learning new tactics designed to exploit the Hellcat's power. They were told never to turn fight a Zero. Instead, they would climb, dive, and strike from advantage. Tactics known as boom and zoom, a war of doctrines. The contrast between Japan's and America's approach was stark. Japanese doctrine emphasized the pilot, mastery, precision, and experience. Their early war aviators were the finest in the world, but their system could not replace them quickly. Training took years, and by 1943, many of their veterans were gone. The United States, meanwhile, emphasized systems, production, logistics, and adaptable training. The Hellcat was designed to make average pilots better and give them a chance to survive. It wasn't just a new fighter. It was a strategic weapon in an industrial war. The Navy knew it was time to test it. The Pacific skies, once ruled by the Zero, were about to host a new challenger. And somewhere across the endless blue, Japanese pilots, confident from years of dominance, would soon glimpse an aircraft unlike any they had ever seen. Its wings were broad, its roar was deeper, its climb relentless. The Hellcat was ready. The first encounters were only days away. The dawn of 1943 brought a new rhythm to the Pacific War, one defined not by desperation, but by momentum. The United States, battered yet unbroken, had learned how to fight. Its factories were alive, its shipyards unending, and its pilots better trained than ever before. The Hellcat arrived at the perfect moment, not as an experimental machine, but as a culmination of every lesson the Navy had paid for in blood. In February, the first squadrons received their aircraft. VF-9 aboard USS Essex, VF-5 on Yorktown, and others soon after. To the men on the flight decks, the F6F looked huge, a brute compared to the nimble Wildcats they'd flown before. But once airborne, its power was unmistakable. Pilots described it as steady, obedient, and strong. It climbed like no carrier fighter before it. And when they tested its guns and 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, the air trembled. The Hellcat wasn't graceful. It didn't dance through the sky like the Zero. It fought like a heavyweight, taking hits, striking hard, refusing to go down. A weapon of industry, every rivet on the Hellcat told the story of American industry's awakening. Grumman's plant in Bethpage expanded ceaselessly, drawing in tens of thousands of workers, men and women both. Across the United States, subcontractors built parts and shipped them east. Aluminum came from Pittsburgh, engines from Connecticut, ammunition belts from New Jersey. Each Hellcat took only weeks to build. Japan's Zeros, by comparison, took months and were often assembled by hand. This was America's new way of waging war, not through individual genius, but through industrial inevitability. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was an idea that a nation of workers, engineers and pilots could together outbuild, outfly and outlast any enemy. Lessons from the Wildcat. Many of the Hellcat's pilots were veterans of the F4F Wildcat and the rugged but limited fighter that had held the line in the darkest year of the Pacific War. Those who had fought in the Coral Sea and at Midway understood what the new machine represented. The Wildcat had been a survivor's aircraft, slower, less agile, but able to take punishment and bring its pilot home. The Hellcat inherited that same soul but amplified it. When a Wildcat dove, it barely escaped the Zero. When a Hellcat dove, it gained the initiative. When a Wildcat met a Zero head-on, it risked disaster. When a Hellcat did, it often came out the victor. The shift wasn't just mechanical. It was psychological. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots felt they could dictate the fight, engineering the advantage. The Hellcat's success wasn't an accident of power alone. Its entire design was built for naval combat, forgiving to land, resistant to damage, and easy to maintain at sea. Its R-2800 double Wasp engine, the same heart that powered the Corsair and the P-47 Thunderbolt, was among the most reliable in the world. With a top speed of around 380 km/h, the Hellcat could climb to altitude faster than a Zero and dive away at will. Armor glass protected the cockpit. Thick plating shielded vital components. The wings folded hydraulically for compact storage on carrier decks, a crucial advantage in a Navy that would soon operate dozens of carriers. The cockpit itself was designed with the pilot in mind. Visibility was clear and wide, with simplified controls that reduced pilot workload during combat. It was the first Navy fighter built with mass production and pilot survivability as twin priorities. Grumman engineers even designed the Hellcat to be easy to repair under primitive conditions. Damaged panels could be replaced quickly, engines swapped within hours. Pilots joked that if you could land it, you could probably fly it again tomorrow, even after taking hits that would have shredded a Zero. America takes the offensive. By mid-1943, the strategic tide of war had turned. The Solomon Islands campaign, particularly the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal, had proven that Japan's early war dominance was waning. The United States was now advancing, island by island, airstrip by airstrip. With each conquest, new air bases sprouted closer to Japan's defensive perimeter. Carrier task forces struck deep into enemy territory. The Hellcat, barely months old, found itself at the forefront of this offensive. Its baptism of fire came in August 1943, over Marcus Island, a small Japanese base far out in the Pacific. Hellcats from USS Yorktown and USS Essex roared off their decks before dawn, escorted by bombers and torpedo planes. The first encounters with the Zero were electrifying. The Japanese pilots, expecting the familiar Wildcats, dove to attack, only to find their prey climbing away, rolling over, and striking back with devastating bursts. Reports from that day spoke of disbelief among the enemy. "This is not the Wildcat," intercepted radio chatter suggested. It climbs too fast. It is too strong. It was the first hint that Japan's air arm had met a machine it could not dominate. Japanese eyes open in late 1943. Intelligence reports reached Tokyo describing a new American carrier fighter that could withstand multiple hits and outclimb the Zero at altitude. At first, commanders dismissed it as exaggerated, propaganda meant to boost American morale. But soon, Japanese airmen began reporting the same encounters. Pilots who returned spoke of enemy aircraft with unmatched power, shrugging off gunfire and firing 6 heavy machine guns with frightening accuracy. Japanese engineers scrambled to analyze the threat. They studied captured wreckage from crashed Hellcats when possible, noting the massive engine and heavy armor. Attempts were made to upgrade the Zero, leading to variants like the A6M5, but Japan's industrial limitations and lack of high-octane fuel made real improvement difficult. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, Japanese pilots were flying into battle with doubt. The numbers game by the end of 1943, Grumman had delivered over 2,500 Hellcats. By the war's end, more than 12,000 would roll off the assembly lines, an astonishing feat for a single design. Each month, squadrons swapped out older Wildcats for the new machines. Training programs adjusted accordingly. The Navy established Hellcat-specific tactics schools to refine aerial combat doctrine. The aircraft's kill ratio began to tell the story no statistician could ignore. For every Hellcat lost, more than 19 enemy planes were destroyed. Behind those numbers were human lives, pilots who now had a fighting chance, and Japanese aces who suddenly found themselves hunted. The carrier revolution. The Hellcat's arrival also coincided with the rise of a new kind of fleet, the Fast Carrier Task Force. Under admirals like Mark Mitcher and Raymond Spruance, carrier groups operated in coordinated strikes across hundreds of miles. With Hellcats providing air superiority, dive bombers and torpedo planes could operate with far less risk. The concept of massed carrier air power reached full maturity, something Japan had pioneered but could no longer sustain. Each strike group could project power across the Pacific at will. From Tarawa to the Marshalls, from the Marianas to the Philippines, Hellcats cleared the skies ahead of the fleet. The Pacific was no longer Japan's hunting ground. It was becoming America's domain. The human element for the young men flying these machines, the Hellcat, meant survival. Pilots described walking the flight deck before dawn, their boots echoing against steel, the smell of oil and sea salt filling the air. Inside the cockpit, they found reassurance in the thick glass, the armored seat, the hum of the engine behind them. It wasn't invincibility they felt. It was trust. Trust in the engineers who built it. Trust in the ship crews who maintained it. Trust that if they flew with discipline, the Hellcat would bring them home. The war still had far to go. But for the first time since 1941, America had a weapon that could go head-to-head with Japan's best and emerge victorious. In the coming months, that weapon would prove itself beyond all doubt. The stage was set for the Hellcat's reckoning, a clash that would define the Pacific skies and forever end the legend of the Zero. Pilots in transition war is as much about men as it is about machines. The F6F Hellcat may have been a masterpiece of engineering, but it was the men inside those cockpits, weary, determined, and impossibly young, who carried its legacy skyward. When the Hellcat first entered service in 1943, America's naval air arm was undergoing a transformation. Many of the pre-war veterans, those who had fought over Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, were either dead, wounded, or reassigned as instructors. A new generation of pilots trained in record numbers now filled the carrier's decks. They were different from their predecessors. Most had never flown before joining the Navy. They came from farms, factories, and cities across the United States. They were products of an industrial war, molded quickly by simulators, trainers, and rigorous instruction in aerial combat tactics. The Hellcat became their classroom, training for survival at Pensacola, Jacksonville, and other naval air stations. Instructors drilled their students in the realities of combat. They studied enemy aircraft recognition charts, practiced deflection shooting, and learned the brutal logic of aerial warfare. See first, strike first, live. Instructors warned them about the Zero. It can turn inside you, but it can't take hits, they would say. Never turn with it, dive away. Use your speed and armor. Those lessons became muscle memory long before the pilots ever saw combat. The Hellcat's design reinforced those teachings. Its control responses were predictable, its stall behavior gentle, its landing gear wide and stable. For many, it was the first fighter they truly felt confident flying. One young aviator, Ensign George Walsh, later described his first flight in the F6F. It was like trading a knife for a broadsword. You didn't need to dance anymore. You could take a hit, swing hard, and still be standing. That feeling and of having a fighting chance then changed everything. The morale shift before the Hellcat. U.S. Navy fighter pilots faced the Zero with a grim sense of duty. They respected the Japanese aircraft and feared its pilots. In the early months of the war, stories of the Zero's invincibility spread across every ready room. But the Hellcat flipped that equation. By late 1943, word began to circulate that the new fighter could not only match the Zero, it could crush it. Pilots returning from their first missions reported astonishing results, kill ratios of 10 to 1, sometimes higher. These victories were not the product of arrogance, but of design meeting discipline. The Hellcat rewarded pilots who fought smart. Those who used altitude, teamwork, and speed found the aircraft nearly unbeatable. Morale soared across the fleet. Where once pilots had braced themselves for desperate defense, now they flew with confidence and even anticipation. The Hellcat gave them not only protection but initiative. Life aboard the carriers. The human story of the Hellcat was also written in the cramped quarters of the great floating airfields that carried them. Aboard USS Essex, Yorktown, Enterprise, and dozens of others, life followed a strict rhythm. Pilots rose before dawn. The metallic smell of aviation fuel mixed with the salt air as crewmen prepared the deck. Briefings began in low-lit ready rooms, maps spread across tables, enemy positions marked in grease pencil. The hum of engines echoed through the steel bulkheads as maintenance crews performed final checks. Each launch was a controlled explosion of coordination. Deck crews in color-coded uniforms, yellow, blue, green, red, they signaled, fueled, armed, and catapulted the aircraft into the pale morning light. Hellcats roared down the deck, engines thundering, propellers whipping spray from the sea. For many pilots, that moment, the instant the deck fell away and the ocean opened beneath them, was both terrifying and transcendent. Once airborne, they climbed into vast Pacific skies where the horizon stretched forever. Alone in that space, the pilot's world shrank to the thrum of the engine, the rattle of oxygen flow and the whisper of radio chatter. In combat, seconds felt like hours. Tracers carved glowing lines through the air, shells punched into fuselages, the sky filled with spirals of smoke, flame and debris, and then, in the silence afterward, the survivor turned homeward, scanning the sea for the narrow rectangle of steel that meant safety. That cycle, brief, violent, exhausting, and repeated every day. The Hellcat became their constant companion, their armor, and sometimes their coffin. The tactical angle, how the Hellcat fought the ABA. Hellcat's design embodied a philosophy of aerial combat, born from hard-earned experience, energy over agility. American tacticians understood that the Zero's turning radius was superior, but its speed and dive characteristics were inferior. The Hellcat exploited this with disciplined tactics that prioritized altitude, speed, and teamwork. The core doctrine was simple: don't turn, climb, dive, and fire. Known as boom and zoom fighting, the method relied on vertical maneuvering. Hellcat pilots approached from above, dove at high speed, fired brief but devastating bursts, and then climbed away before the Zero could react. The Hellcat's heavier construction gave it an advantage in dives. It could exceed 400 miles per hour without structural failure, something the lighter Zero could not safely do. Teamwork in the sky. American pilots rarely fought alone. The U.S. Navy emphasized formation tactics, 2 plane elements known as sections and 4 plane groups known as divisions. Each section consisted of a leader and a wingman. The leader attacked. The wingman watched his back. The simplicity of this system contrasted sharply with Japanese tactics, which often relied on individual dogfighting skill. The Hellcat's radio communication system made coordination easier. Pilots could call out enemy positions, direct attacks, or warn others in real time. This situational awareness multiplied their effectiveness in large-scale engagements. When 2 or more divisions worked together, They could tear through enemy formations with brutal efficiency. One Japanese ace later remarked, "We fought men who never came alone. You shot at one and two more came from the sun." The combat environment, aerial combat over the Pacific, was unlike any other theater of the war. There were no cities, no landmarks, just endless water and the distant haze of islands. Pilots navigated using compasses, dead reckoning, and carrier-based radar guidance. If a pilot bailed out or ditched, rescue was uncertain. The sea below was both savior and grave. Sharks, exposure, and exhaustion claimed many who survived combat. In that vast, unforgiving space, the Hellcat's durability saved countless lives. Pilots often returned with shredded wings, riddled fuselages, and engines leaking oil, yet still flying. Photographs from carrier decks show Hellcats riddled with bullet holes, sometimes missing entire control surfaces, yet parked neatly after landing. The aircraft's toughness became legend. Adapting to the enemy as encounters increased, pilots refined their techniques against the Zero. They learned to use high-speed slashing attacks and vertical maneuvers to force Japanese pilots into losing energy. Hellcat squadrons also benefited from radar direction. American carriers and land bases employed fighter direction officers who guided intercepts via radio, vectoring Hellcats toward incoming raids long before they were visible. Japan had no equivalent system. Their pilots often fought blind, relying on visual contact and intuition. This technological and tactical advantage allowed the Hellcat to engage the enemy on favorable terms nearly every time. The birth of aces, the Hellcat's dominance in combat, produced a generation of American aces. Names like David McCampbell, Eugene Valencia, and Alexander Vratsiu became symbols of naval air power. McCampbell, commanding VF-15 aboard USS Essex, achieved 34 aerial victories, all in Hellcats. On one day alone, October 24, 1944, he shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. These men were not reckless. Their success came from discipline, exploiting the Hellcat's strengths and avoiding its weaknesses. They knew the Zero could turn tighter, so they refused to turn. They knew the Zero lacked armor, so they struck once, hard, and disengaged. Their methodical approach was the opposite of romantic dogfighting. It was engineering turned into tactics. Combat reports pilots. After-action reports read like mechanical poetry. Made pass on 2 Zeeks from 10,000 feet. Fired short burst. Observed hits on engine and cockpit. Broke high right. Second burst set fire to wing. The brevity of their language belied the chaos of battle. In those seconds, life and death hung on reflexes, angle, and luck. For the Japanese, these encounters were demoralizing. Their veteran ranks were thinning, and replacements lacked experience. Facing disciplined American pilots in superior machines, their odds dwindled. The sky turns by early 1944. Japanese commanders began to notice a disturbing pattern. Every major engagement cost them more aircraft than they could replace. Pilots who had once ruled the Pacific now faced a new kind of enemy, one they could not outfight through skill alone. The Zero. Once the hunter had become the hunted, and as the Hellcat's reputation grew, so too did its pilots' confidence. They began to speak not of surviving missions, but of controlling them. The balance of the air war had shifted, from agility to endurance, from artistry to industry, from fear to mastery. The Hellcat had proven itself a weapon of men and machines in perfect harmony, but that harmony would soon be tested in the largest carrier battle in history, where hundreds of these fighters would meet the Zero in the decisive clash of the Pacific skies, the machine that redefined naval aviation at its core. The F6F Hellcat was not simply a fighter aircraft. It was a manifestation of American design philosophy under pressure, practical, unromantic, and focused entirely on one question: how to win a global war. The contrast between the Hellcat and the Japanese Zero revealed 2 radically different industrial worlds. Japan built the Zero for performance, every ounce trimmed for agility and range. America built the Hellcat for survival, every plate, bolt, and weld placed to protect the pilot and ensure the machine could fly again tomorrow. Grumman's engineers understood the brutal truth of naval aviation. The ocean was merciless, the enemy relentless, and the pilot irreplaceable, so they built the Hellcat to endure all 3. The heart, Pratt & Whitney's double wasp, The engine defined the aircraft. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 10W Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder radial engine, was the same powerhouse that propelled the F4U Corsair and the P-47 Thunderbolt. For the Hellcat, it provided raw, relentless thrust, enough to haul its 13,000-pound frame off carrier decks with authority and to climb over 3,000 feet per minute. It could take damage and keep turning. Pilots reported returning from missions with cylinders shot away, oil streaming across the canopy, yet the engine never quit. In contrast, the Zero's Nakajima Saki engine was a masterpiece of light engineering, efficient but fragile. It lacked the armor protection, self-sealing systems, and reliability needed for long campaigns. The Hellcat's engine symbolized the shift in war philosophy. Better to be tough than delicate, armor and armament. The Hellcat was a fortress with wings. It carried 212 pounds of cockpit armor, 50 pounds protecting its oil cooler, and another 100 around fuel tanks and vital systems. The Zero carried almost none. Its 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. They were synchronized and harmonized to converge at 300 yards, a curtain of fire that no unarmored plane could survive. A typical burst from those guns, lasting barely 2 seconds, delivered nearly a pound of lead, enough to tear through wings, fuselages, or engines. The Hellcat also carried up to 2,000 pounds of bombs or rockets for ground attack, transforming it from a pure fighter into a strike aircraft. It wasn't elegant, but it was devastatingly effective. By late 1944, Hellcats were not only sweeping the skies but bombing airfields, strafing convoys, and escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. The fighter had evolved into a multi-role weapon, years before that term even existed. The structure. The Hellcat's frame was simple but strong. A full monocoque fuselage gave it rigidity, while wide-set landing gear provided stability during carrier landings, an advantage even over the Corsair, which had a tendency to bounce and drift on touchdown. Its wings, folding hydraulically at the roots, allowed more aircraft to fit aboard a carrier. Each fold was tested thousands of times under load. Failure rates were near zero. The canopy design gave pilots excellent visibility, something that could mean life or death during a turning fight. Even maintenance reflected Grumman's pragmatism. Panels were standardized and easy to remove. Mechanics could replace damaged parts without specialized tools. The result was minimal downtime, even during continuous operations in tropical heat and salt air. Every element of the Hellcat was designed for repair, not replacement. Radar and communication as the war advanced. American carriers and fighters integrated radar-guided interception tactics. The Hellcat's radio systems were reliable even in heavy weather and over long distances, a crucial advantage in the Pacific, where visual range could stretch for hundreds of miles with no landmarks. Ground-based radar stations, shipborne arrays, and airborne radar pickets began to coordinate with fighter direction officers. These systems guided Hellcat squadrons into interception positions before enemy planes could even see them. It was a revolution in warfare, the marriage of electronics and air power. By contrast, Japanese forces relied almost entirely on visual spotting and loose communication between units. When Hellcats arrived, guided by radar, they often struck unseen and unopposed, the enemy never realizing how they'd been found. Technology, not just tactics, was rewriting the Pacific sky. For Japan, the arrival of the Hellcat was like facing a mirror, one that reflected the limits of their empire. Their pilots, once confident and untouchable, began to encounter an enemy who could absorb their attacks and strike back harder. The first combat reports from 1943 shocked Japanese commanders. Veteran pilot Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces, described an encounter with what he initially thought was an improved Wildcat. I fired and saw my shells strike his fuselage and wings, yet he did not fall. He turned toward me faster than I expected and his guns lit up the sky. I barely escaped. The disbelief turned to dread as more units reported similar outcomes. Zeros riddled Hellcats with fire, only to watch them continue fighting. Japanese intelligence officers began compiling assessments. Their conclusions were grim. The new American fighter was superior in nearly every category except turn radius. By late 1943, Japan's greatest weakness was no longer technology, it was manpower. Years of attrition had gutted the Imperial Navy's elite airmen. The rigorous pre-war training pipeline had produced the finest carrier pilots in the world, but it also took years to complete. Wartime replacements were rushed through abbreviated programs, receiving barely a fraction of the flight hours once required. The Hellcat arrived precisely as Japan's pilot quality collapsed. Inexperienced flyers, sent into combat with minimal training, faced American pilots armed with better machines, superior coordination, and radar support. Losses mounted at an unsustainable pace. Each Hellcat victory deepened the crisis. The once feared Zero squadrons were now losing entire formations in a single day. Japanese engineers tried desperately to counter the Hellcat's superiority. They produced upgraded Zeros, the A6M5 series, with thicker skin, improved engines, and slightly better dive performance. But without high-octane fuel and sufficient raw materials, the changes were marginal. More ambitious designs, like the Kawanishi N1K George and Nakajima Ki 84. Frank offered competitive performance, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers. Japan's aircraft industry, starved by Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not compete with America's industrial flood. By 1944, Grumman was producing more Hellcats per month than Japan could build fighters in total. It was not just a battle of pilots. It was a battle of economies. For years, the Zero had been more than an aircraft to Japan. It was a symbol of technological mastery, of divine protection, of national pride. Its legend was woven into wartime propaganda, used to assure the public that Japan's skies were secure. The Hellcat shattered that illusion. As Hellcats swept across the Pacific, the myth of Japanese invincibility disintegrated. American pilots, once fearful, now spoke of turkey shoots. Reports from the front detailed staggering kill ratios. During major operations like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Hellcats annihilated Japanese air groups before they could even reach their targets. For the Japanese people, the silence that followed those defeats was deafening. The Empire's pilots were no longer gods of the sky. They were young men flying into certain death. Japan's early victories had bred a dangerous belief that superior skill could overcome any material disadvantage. The Zero's success at the start of the war reinforced that faith. But by 1943, the war had become industrial, and Japan's romantic notion of warfare could not survive it. The Hellcat was the physical embodiment of that shift, heavy, powerful, and built not for glory, but for attrition. In the face of such machines, courage alone was no longer enough. The skies over the Pacific became graveyards of ambition. For every victory claimed by a Hellcat pilot, a Japanese aviator died in the fireball of a disintegrating Zero. Those who survived often described the haunting aftermath: parachutes drifting down to empty sea, oil fires burning on the waves, the distant crackle of dying engines. Both sides fought with conviction. But one side could replace its dead, repair its machines, and learn from its mistakes. The other could not. The psychological divide widened. American pilots began to see the Hellcat as a guardian, a weapon that ensured they could fight again tomorrow. Japanese pilots began to see it as a shadow, a hunter that waited for them beyond every cloud. By mid-1944, the Hellcat had done more than reclaim the skies. It had broken Japan's faith in its own air power. Carrier after carrier was stripped of trained airmen. Bases that once launched hundreds of sorties now lay silent. Even the introduction of desperate tactics, such as kamikaze strikes, reflected this psychological collapse. The age of the Zero was ending. The empire that had begun the war with unmatched skill and daring was now outnumbered. Outgunned and outflown, in its place rose a new kind of dominance, the dominance of mass production and mechanical reliability over human romanticism. The Hellcat had done what no other fighter had managed since 1941. It had turned the hunter into the hunted and shattered the myth of Japan's aerial supremacy. But the full scale of its triumph, and the battle that would prove it beyond doubt, was still to come. Ahead lay the Marianas, the largest carrier clash in history, and the defining moment when the Hellcat would finally prove that the age of the Zero was over. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned irrevocably. The U.S. Navy was pushing westward in an unstoppable chain of island assaults. From Tarawa to Kwajalein, from Truk to the Marshalls, every captured atoll became a new stepping stone toward Japan's inner defenses. Now, the American fleet's eyes were fixed on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were not just another strategic waypoint. They were the gateway to Japan itself. From their airfields, the U.S. could launch the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, capable of reaching Tokyo. The Imperial Navy knew this, and they would not let it happen without a fight. What was about to unfold over the Philippine Sea would be the largest carrier battle in history, and the Hellcat's moment of absolute reckoning. On June 15, 1944, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Saipan under the cover of the Fifth Fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance's armada, commanded in the air by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. It was a fleet of unmatched scale. Aircraft carriers 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 67 destroyers, and in their hangars, over 900 F6F Hellcats, the largest concentration of naval fighters ever assembled. Facing them was Japan's mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sailing from the Philippines and the Bonin Islands. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with about 430 aircraft, mostly A6M5, Zeros and a mix of dive bombers and torpedo planes. But beneath those numbers lay a stark imbalance. The Japanese pilots were inexperienced, many with fewer than 100 flight hours. The Americans, by contrast, were combat-hardened, guided by radar, and flying machines that could take immense punishment. The outcome was not yet certain, but the odds were already written in steel and training. That night, aboard the carriers Lexington, Enterprise, and Yorktown, Hellcat pilots were briefed for what was coming. Intelligence intercepts and radar sweeps indicated the Japanese fleet was approaching from the west. Pilots memorized call signs, engagement patterns, and radio frequencies. They checked ammunition belts, fuel loads, and gun harmonization. In ready rooms across the fleet, men smoked quietly, their faces lit by red lamps and maps scattered with grease pencil lines. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. This would be the decisive air battle of the Pacific. At 0530, radar operators aboard the carrier Enterprise picked up faint blips, dozens, then hundreds, 150 miles out. The Japanese had launched their first strike. Admiral Mitcher's voice crackled over the intercom. "Get those Hellcats airborne." Engines roared across the fleet as 450 F6F Hellcats catapulted into the sky. In groups of 4, they climbed through cloud layers, forming combat air patrol screens over the task force. Each pilot's oxygen mask muffled his breathing, his hands tight on the stick. The first wave of enemy aircraft appeared as black dots against the morning sun. At 10:36 a.m., radar intercept controllers vectored the Hellcats toward them. Commander David McCampbell, later to become America's top naval ace, led one of the first interceptions. He described it simply. They came in neat formations. We went right through them. The first wave collides as the two forces met at 20,000 feet. The sky erupted. Japanese bombers, weighed down with torpedoes, began their long, shallow dives toward the carriers below. But the Hellcats were waiting. McCampbell and his squadron tore into the attackers head-on, guns blazing. Tracers ripped through the air, white streaks of death intersecting the formation. Zeros tried to cover the bombers, but the Hellcats' speed and firepower overwhelmed them. In the first engagement alone, over 25 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Not a single bomb reached an American carrier. As the second and third waves approached, the pattern repeated. Each was detected by radar 100 miles out, intercepted by Hellcats long before reaching the fleet. By noon, hundreds of wrecked Japanese aircraft littered the sea, their fuel igniting the surface in orange bursts. American pilots began calling the slaughter over the radio. It's like shooting turkeys at a carnival. The name would stick, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese collapsed by late afternoon. The Japanese had launched 4 separate strike waves, nearly 350 aircraft in total. Only a few dozen made it back to their carriers. Many of those that did were too damaged to fly again. On the American side, the results were staggering. Hellcats had destroyed over 250 enemy planes in the air, for the loss of just 29 U.S. aircraft. Radar coordination, disciplined formations, and overwhelming firepower had turned what could have been a dangerous battle into a one-sided annihilation. Commander McCampbell himself shot down 7 aircraft that day, setting the stage for his legendary status. But the battle was not yet over. Mitcher and Spruance knew the Japanese fleet was still out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, battered, yes, but not destroyed. The Hellcats had broken the enemy's wings, but the carriers that launched them remained afloat. That would change the following day. Nightfall. A new hunt begins. As the sun sank over the Philippine Sea, the horizon glowed with burning wrecks. Oil slicks stretched for miles. The air still smelled of cordite and salt. American search planes combed the darkness, hunting for the retreating Japanese fleet. At midnight, radio intercepts and reconnaissance revealed Ozawa's position, 250 miles away. Moving north, it was the perfect chance to finish the job, but distance was a problem. Launching a strike that far risked losing planes to fuel exhaustion before they could return. It was a deadly gamble. Admiral Mitcher weighed the risk in silence. Around him, his staff waited for an order. Finally, he said, launch them all. It would be one of the boldest decisions of the Pacific War, and one that would define the Hellcats' legacy forever. That night decision would lead to a twilight assault, a battle fought at the edge of range, where fuel and courage would determine who survived. And as the Hellcats lifted off into the fading light of June 20th, 1944, they carried not just the hope of victory, but the weight of every pilot who had fallen before them. The twilight strike, June 20th, 1944. The decision had been made. As darkness fell over the Philippine Sea, the decks of 15 American carriers roared to life once more. Flight crews scrambled under flickering deck lamps, rushing to arm aircraft for a night assault. The air smelled of aviation fuel, hot oil, and salt. The target: Admiral Ozawa's retreating fleet, the remnants of Japan's carrier strength, limping north after the disaster of June 19th. But there was a problem. The enemy was over 250 miles away, at the extreme limit of the Hellcats' and bombers' range. The pilots would have to fly into the setting sun, attack at dusk, and somehow find their way back in complete darkness to tiny, moving decks. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher knew what he was asking. He also knew the war demanded it. At 4:09 p.m., he gave the order, launch the strike. The launch carrier decks tilted into the wind as the fleet turned east, one by one. 216 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers thundered down the decks into the crimson glow of sunset. The scene was both beautiful and ominous. The sun dipped low over the horizon, turning the sea into molten gold. The aircraft climbed into it, black silhouettes against the dying light. Among them flew seasoned Hellcat pilots like Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, Alexander Vryshew, and Wilhelm Esters, men who had already spent the morning shooting down Zeros and were now being sent out again. Each pilot knew this might be a one-way mission. Fuel calculations were grim. At full throttle, they would barely make it back, if at all. The search for 2 hours, the strike group flew west across an empty ocean. Navigation was primitive, compass bearings, dead reckoning, and a prayer. At 6:30 p.m., lookouts in the lead Hellcats sighted faint shadows below, ships. Moments later, the entire Japanese fleet came into view, silhouetted against the fading sunset. Ozawa's force had been reduced to a skeleton. The carriers Taiho and Shokaku had already been sunk by American submarines earlier that day. Now only the Zuikaku Junyo and a handful of light carriers remained, protected by a screen of cruisers and destroyers. It was all that was left of Japan's once mighty carrier arm. The Americans dove to attack. The assault. The Hellcats came first, sweeping down to strafe the decks and clear the skies of any remaining Japanese fighters. There were few, perhaps a dozen, and they were quickly cut apart. Behind them came the Helldiver dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes, releasing bombs and torpedoes through thick anti-aircraft fire. Explosions tore through the night. The carrier Hio was hit squarely by torpedoes amidships. Flames erupted, racing through her hangars. Moments later, she was engulfed in a massive explosion, a column of fire reaching hundreds of feet into the sky. The carrier Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, was hit multiple times. Her decks burned and her air group was annihilated. The Japanese destroyers maneuvered frantically to rescue survivors, their wakes glowing red in the fiery reflection. Above them, Hellcats circled like steel hawks, shooting down any escaping aircraft and strafing the burning decks below. For the Japanese sailors watching from the water, the sky was filled with the thunder of American engines and the crimson light of falling ordnance. The age of Japan's carrier dominance was ending, right before their eyes. The long way. Home by 7:45 p.m., the attack was complete. The American pilots turned east toward home, but the sun was gone. Darkness swallowed the sea. Without radar beacons or visible landmarks, finding their carriers would be almost impossible. Many pilots realized they were flying blind, low on fuel, hundreds of miles from safety. Over the radio came quiet, tense voices. Any carrier? This is 3-1 red, fuel critical. I don't see the fleet. I'm bingo. Some pilots dropped into the Black Ocean hoping to be rescued. Others pushed on, their instruments dimming. Aboard the carrier Lexington, Admiral Mitcher faced an agonizing decision. Standard procedure required blackout conditions to avoid submarine attack. No lights, no signals, but he knew his men were out there, circling, lost in the night. At 8:45 p.m., he gave a historic order. Turn on the lights. The lights in the darkness one by one. The great ships of Task Force 58 illuminated their decks. Searchlights pointed upward, forming beacons in the night. Signal lamps blinked across the horizon. Cruisers and destroyers turned on their navigation lights, creating glowing outlines across the dark sea. From the air, it was a breathtaking sight. And for hundreds of exhausted pilots, it was salvation. Hellcats appeared out of the night, their engines sputtering. Some landed hard, skidding across the decks. Others crashed into the sea just short of the carriers, their fuel spent. In total, over 80 aircraft were lost, most to fuel exhaustion or night crashes, not enemy action. But the fleet had found its way home. Mitcher's decision to illuminate the carriers, though risky, saved the majority of his air crews. When dawn broke on June 21st, the Pacific was calm again, but the Imperial Japanese Navy was broken. The aftermath of the Marianas. The results of the 2-day battle were staggering. Japan lost 3 carriers, 2 oilers, and over 600 aircraft. The U.S. lost just 123 aircraft, most of them due to operational causes. The kill ratio was almost 20-1 in favor of the Hellcat, the Imperial Navy's elite pilot corps. The men who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 was gone. Replacements would never reach the same skill or experience. The Japanese carrier fleet, once the pride of the empire, would never again mount an effective large-scale operation. In 2 days, the Hellcat had done what no bomber or battleship could. It had erased Japan's air power. The final symbol. When the last fires of the Hio faded into the sea, so too did the myth of the Zero. The machine that had once ruled the skies of the Pacific had been crushed not by a miracle weapon, but by something far more powerful: industrial will. The Hellcat had been designed, tested, and built in less than a year. It was the product of factories that ran 24 hours a day, of engineers who never stopped refining, and of a nation that had learned, through loss and sacrifice, how to wage total war. Each Hellcat represented not just a fighter aircraft, but an entire economic and psychological transformation. America had learned how to turn industry into victory, and Japan had learned what it meant to face a machine built not for beauty, but for endurance. The Pacific skies, once ruled by Zeros and samurai discipline, now belonged to the heavy, roaring wings of Grumman iron. But victory came at a price. For every pilot who survived the long night over the Philippine Sea, there remained the memory of those who did not, men who had flown into the dark and never returned. Their sacrifice marked not just the end of an empire, but the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where machines, industry, and strategy decided the fate of nations. And as the carriers turned homeward, the Hellcats lined their decks in silence, wings folded, engines quiet. The battle was over. The legend was sealed. From that night on, no Japanese carrier force would ever again challenge the U.S. Navy. The Hellcat had not only crushed the Zero, it had ended Japan's dream of aerial supremacy forever. The silence after victory, Fier. Morning of June 21st, 1944, dawned quietly over the Philippine Sea. The sea that had burned for 2 days now lay still, marked only by oil slicks and scattered debris, fragments of wings, fuel tanks, and life vests. Here and there, small rescue boats searched among the waves for survivors. The wind carried no sound of engines, no echo of combat, only the low hum of destroyer turbines and the clatter of recovery cranes. For the men aboard the American carriers, exhaustion replaced adrenaline. The pilots who had survived the longest, most decisive aerial battle of the Pacific now sat in silence, helmets in their laps, faces drawn by salt, sweat, and grief. They had won us decisively, even gloriously, but victory had a strange stillness to it. The Hellcat had proven itself beyond question, yet the price of that triumph, the lives lost to fuel starvation, the empty seats in the ready rooms, and tempered every cheer. It was the paradox of modern war, triumph and loss, welded together in the same silence. The numbers tell the story. By the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the statistics were beyond anything seen before in aerial warfare. Japan. 3 fleet carriers and 2 oilers sunk, 2 carriers heavily damaged, and over 600 aircraft destroyed, nearly all of its carrier-based air strength. United States, 123 aircraft lost, mostly to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents, only about 30 in combat. In terms of pilot experience, the loss was catastrophic for Japan. Most of their surviving airmen were now either wounded, grounded, or so traumatized they would never return to combat. This was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a strategic disembowelment. For the remainder of the war, Japan would never again recover the pilot skill, production capacity, or technological balance needed to challenge the U.S. in the air. The Hellcat, born of industrial efficiency and raw durability, had achieved something extraordinary. It had dismantled an entire aerial empire in less than 12 months of combat. A machine that delivered, between 1943 and 1945, the F6F Hellcat would go on to score 5,163 aerial victories, more than any other Allied naval aircraft in World War II. Its official kill-to-loss ratio stood at 19-1, a figure unmatched in large-scale fighter operations. In every major carrier battle of the late Pacific War, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, the Hellcat dominated. Its pilots included some of the most decorated aviators in history. David McCampbell, 34 confirmed kills. The U.S. Navy's top ace, Alexander Vrashu, 19 kills, including 6 in just 8 minutes during the Marianas. Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first Ace and Medal of Honor recipient, who flew both the Wildcat and the Hellcat before his death in 1943. The machine earned their trust. It brought them home from missions others would not have survived. Pilots often said it flew like a Wildcat on steroids. Stable, forgiving, yet immensely powerful. It could climb fast, dive harder, and take damage no Zero could match. In the words of one squadron leader, the Hellcat wasn't pretty, but it saved lives. That's what mattered. Japan's aerial collapse, the devastation of the Marianas, broke the spine of Japan's carrier air force, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most formidable in the world, now found itself with only a handful of operational carriers and even fewer trained aviators. In desperation, Japanese command began converting transport ships into makeshift escort carriers and fast-tracking pilot training programs. The results were tragic. By late 1944, most new pilots had fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. They were being sent into combat against veteran American pilots flying superior machines, supported by radar, and guided by radio coordination. The outcome was inevitable. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan launched what remained of its carrier force as a decoy, empty of aircraft, used purely to lure the U.S. fleet north. That was how far they had fallen. Carriers, once the pride of the empire, had become hollow symbols, bait rather than weapons. In their place, Japan turned to kamikaze tactics, suicide pilots who crashed their aircraft into ships. It was a grim acknowledgement that skill and machinery could no longer compete. The Hellcat had forced Japan into desperation. A sky owned by Grumman by 1945, the U.S. Navy's skies were filled almost entirely with Hellcats. Grumman's factories on Long Island, New York, known affectionately as the Iron Works, were producing up to 500 Hellcats a month. Workers there called the aircraft Grumman's toughest cat, and the name fit perfectly. Every new batch arrived at the docks already painted in navy blue-gray, ready for the next wave of island assaults. The production was so relentless that by war's end, over 12,200 Hellcats had been built, more than the total number of all Japanese carrier aircraft combined. Each one represented a triumph of engineering pragmatism, easy to maintain, easy to fly, and deadly effective. In an age where elegant aircraft like the Spitfire or the Zero captured hearts with their beauty, the Hellcat captured victory with its endurance. The end of the Zero for the Japanese Zero. The end came not with a single battle, but with quiet obsolescence. By 1944, it was a relic, outclassed in speed, firepower, and protection. Its thin aluminum skin and unarmored fuel tanks, once an advantage in range and agility, had become fatal flaws. The once legendary fighter was now being cut down in droves. Pilots who had once dominated the skies of the Pacific now died in hopeless, one-sided duels. In the words of Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war, "The Zero was our pride, but by 1944 it was a coffin. We were sending boys to die in machines that could not survive a single hit." The Hellcat had made every one of the Zero's strengths irrelevant, and as it did, it transformed the entire philosophy of air combat, from one of romantic duels to one of calculated efficiency, from battlefields to legacy. When the war finally reached its climax in 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hellcat was still flying patrols over the Pacific. It had escorted bombers, sunk ships, strafed convoys, and destroyed aircraft on the ground across every major front from the Gilbert Islands to Okinawa. By the time peace was declared, the Hellcat's pilots had secured over 75% of all aerial victories achieved by the U.S. Navy. Its performance was so consistent that many historians later called it the most successful naval fighter in history. Not because it was glamorous, but because it worked. It didn't break, it didn't burn easily, it didn't fail its pilot. And that, in the brutal arithmetic of total war, was the ultimate measure of success. Yet beneath the triumph lay a haunting reality, one that would linger long after the gunfire ceased. The skies of the Pacific were now filled not with combat, but with wrecks. Beneath those waves lay the remains of two generations of pilots, American and Japanese, who had fought, bled, and died in pursuit of dominance. The Hellcat had brought one side victory, but it had also brought the world to a moment of reckoning, because in its shadow, the line between heroism and annihilation had become thinner than ever. And as the Pacific campaign moved toward its final, desperate phase, Okinawa, and then Japan itself, the lessons of the Hellcat's triumph would shape everything that followed. The long road home. When the war ended in August 1945, thousands of Hellcats sat idle on carrier decks and airfields across the Pacific, machines built for battles that would never come. Some bore the scars of dogfights, bullet holes patched with rivets, chipped paint, scorched exhausts. Others were pristine, never having seen combat, delivered too late to matter. For the men who had flown them, returning home was a strange transition. Pilots who had lived by the sound of roaring Pratt & Whitney engines now returned to quiet neighborhoods, their uniforms hanging loose on bodies still tense with muscle memory. The war had defined them. And the Hellcat, that heavy, dependable beast, had been their partner through it all. At naval bases from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, decommissioning crews began to strip and scrap the planes. Metal was recycled. Parts were salvaged. The war machine dissolved into peacetime industry, and yet, every pilot who watched one be dismantled knew what it represented, the machine that had carried them through fire and back again. Japan's shattered skies. In Japan, the silence was even deeper. The Zero, once the pride of the empire, was now a symbol of ruin. The factories that built it had been reduced to rubble. The pilots who had flown it were gone, lost to the sea or entombed in the jungles of the Pacific. By 1945, the Japanese Air Force was no longer an organized fighting force. Its final operations consisted of desperate kamikaze missions, often flown by barely trained students in outdated aircraft. The once proud Naval Air Arm, the force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor, had been annihilated by relentless American production and industrial might. What had begun as a contest of skill and courage had ended as a war of machinery and mass. The F6F Hellcat was the embodiment of that transformation. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Where Japan could produce hundreds, America could produce thousands. Where Japan trained pilots in months, the U.S. did so in weeks, and replaced every loss instantly. The era of the lone ace was over. The era of the industrial air war had begun. The legacy of Grumman's ironworks after the war, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the company that built the Hellcat, became a symbol of American aviation excellence. Its engineers, led by Leroy Grumman and William Schwendler, were hailed for their practical, almost stubborn design philosophy. They never built the lightest aircraft. They built the ones that survived. The Hellcat's design principles, toughness, modularity, and reliability, influenced nearly every U.S. Navy fighter that followed, from the F8F Bearcat to the F-14 Tomcat 3 decades later. Inside Grumman's factories, workers took pride in their role. Many were women, Rosie the Riveters, who had entered the workforce for the first time. They had assembled the Hellcats that dominated the Pacific, each rivet a quiet contribution to victory. In post-war America, when peace returned, many of these women left their jobs, but the memory of what they'd built remained. The Hellcat wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of collective effort, a machine forged by an entire nation. Remembering the airmen, every victory had a name behind it, and often, accost pilots like David McCampbell, who became America's top naval ace, would later speak of the emotional burden of combat. He remembered not the thrill of kills, but the faces of friends who didn't return. People call us heroes, he said years later. But we were just doing our duty. The real heroes were the ones who didn't come back. For Japanese survivors like Saburo Sakai, the memories were even more painful. He lost his comrades, his country, and his cause. Yet he lived to tell the story of their courage. Sakai often spoke of his respect for the American pilots he fought, calling them honorable enemies. His memoirs reveal a haunting truth. Both sides had believed in something greater than themselves, and both paid dearly for it. The skies over the Pacific became a graveyard of ideals, and in that graveyard, the Hellcat reigned supreme, not as a symbol of glory, but as the machine that decided fate. The birth of naval air supremacy. The Hellcat's success fundamentally reshaped naval doctrine. Before 1942, battleships had ruled the seas. By 1945, aircraft carriers and the Iwer planes they launched and were the undisputed masters of naval warfare. The F6F Hellcat had proven that naval air power could destroy entire fleets without a single shell being fired. Every major fleet engagement from the Marianas to Okinawa had been decided not by gunfire, but by airstrikes. This realization changed everything. Post-war naval design revolved around carriers, not guns. Strategy revolved around air groups, not broadsides. In many ways, the Hellcat was not just a fighter. It was a messenger of the future. It marked the end of the battleship era and the dawn of modern air power. A machine of transition. By 1946, the jet age had arrived. The Hellcat's piston engine, once the pinnacle of naval aviation, was already becoming obsolete. The Navy began testing jet fighters like the McDonnell F-H Phantom and Grumman F-9F Panther, sleeker, faster, and built for a new kind of war. Yet, even as technology leapt forward, the Hellcat refused to fade quietly. It remained in service with the U.S. Navy Reserve until the early 1950s and saw combat in limited roles. During the early Cold War, some were sold to foreign nations, France, Argentina, and Uruguay, where they flew for years after the war. A few were even used in Hollywood war films, their rugged silhouettes forever linked to the memory of the Pacific War. The legacy measured in steel and memory today. Only a handful of Hellcats remain airworthy. Most rest in museums, silent, restored, and revered. Their dark navy blue skins gleam under hangar lights, their propellers still, their cockpits empty but intact. Visitors often stop beneath their wings, reading the plaques that tell of Guadalcanal, the Marianas, Okinawa. What those plaques cannot capture is what it felt like to sit in one, to smell the oil, feel the vibration of that massive Pratt & Whitney engine, to face death and somehow live through it. The Hellcat was a machine of survival. It didn't promise victory through grace or speed. It delivered it through sheer resilience. It was the working-class hero of the air war. Rough, reliable, and utterly unforgiving, a symbol of industrial warfare. In a larger sense, the Hellcat symbolized the industrial heart of the Second World War. It represented a nation's ability to translate raw material into power, design into dominance. For every 0 Japan built, America built 10 Hellcats. For every lost pilot, 3 more were trained. It was this imbalance of industry, manpower, and logistics that turned the tide of the Pacific. The Hellcat was the proof. It wasn't the smartest design or the most beautiful, but it worked under the brutal conditions of war, and that made all the difference. In the words of Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded Task Force 58, the Hellcat was not just a fighter, it was a war-winning instrument. It did what it was built to do, destroy the enemy and bring our boys home. The end of one war, the beginning of another. Hellcat's success marked the end of one kind of war and the beginning of another. In its shadow, new doctrines emerged. Nuclear deterrence, jet propulsion, global strategy. The very efficiency that made the Hellcat so effective would define the Cold War. Mass production, technological escalation, and the belief that superiority in the sky meant safety on the ground. Yet the memory of the Pacific Air War lingered, a reminder of what such dominance cost. For every gleaming Hellcat in a museum, there are thousands of wrecks beneath the Pacific waves. Each one tells the story of courage, loss, and the terrible speed of human progress. The fighter that crushed the Zero had done more than defeat an enemy. It had ushered in the age of total air supremacy, and with it, a new kind of world. As the last Hellcats returned to rusting hangars and quiet airfields, the Pacific finally fell silent. But that silence carried an echo, the low hum of engines, the cry of the sea, the memory of a time when the sky itself decided the fate of nations. And within that echo lived a name that every Japanese pilot learned to fear, and every American one learned to trust, the F6F Hellcat. The machine that redefined the sky history often remembers wars through their weapons. But few machines ever defined a turning point so completely as the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It was not a revolutionary aircraft in appearance or theory. It did not emerge from secret blueprints or radical aerodynamic experiments. It was born instead from necessity, from lessons written in the wreckage of the early Pacific defeats. When the Zero ruled the skies, the U.S. Navy needed something that could not just fight, but endure. And so engineers at Grumman built a fighter that embodied the industrial soul of America. Simple, strong, and scalable. The Hellcat was not designed to dance. It was designed to survive, and in surviving, it destroyed everything that came before it. From 1943 to 1945, it turned the Pacific into a one-sided arena, where skill met industry, and industry won. The lesson of the Hellcat every war teaches a lesson. The Hellcat's was brutal and clear. Courage alone cannot win without production, logistics, and design. Japan's Zero had been a masterpiece of agility and grace, a marvel of early war engineering. But it belonged to a world that still believed wars were fought by heroes, not factories. The Hellcat shattered that illusion. It was proof that the new wars would be won by those who could build faster, train faster, and repair faster. In its rivets and armor lay a new philosophy, one that valued function over form, power over purity, survival over spectacle. It was not just an aircraft. It was a statement that the modern battlefield no longer rewarded beauty. It rewarded resilience. The men who flew it, and yet, for all its industrial strength, the Hellcat was still deeply human. Every sortie, every launch from a pitching carrier deck was a test of nerve. The men who strapped themselves into those cockpits carried not only the hopes of their fleet, but the weight of those who had fallen before them. They were sons of mechanics, farmers and factory workers, young men who had learned to fly in a world on fire. For them, the Hellcat was more than an aircraft. It was home. Its thick armor and heavy controls gave them confidence. They trusted it to bring them back, even when riddled with holes. They painted its noses with shark mouths, victory tallies, and lucky charms, each one a whisper to fate. The bond between pilot and plane was not romantic. It was something deeper, born of fear and survival, of long hours over endless water, of knowing that this machine might be the only thing between life and the ocean below, the end of the ace, before the Hellcat. Air combat was often romanticized, the lone duelist, the hero in the sky, but the Hellcat changed that image forever. Its victories were not won by isolated brilliance but by coordination, radar control, teamwork, and industrial continuity. It marked the beginning of systemic warfare, where success came not from a single ace's skill, but from thousands of men and women working together, mechanics, radio operators, ship crews, engineers, and the workers in the factories of Long Island. The era of the lone ace died with the Zero. The era of the aerial system, efficient, collective, relentless, was born with the Hellcat. A symbol. Beyond war in time, the Hellcat became something more than a weapon. To Americans, it came to symbolize ingenuity under pressure, a triumph of engineering over adversity. To the Japanese, it became a haunting emblem of lost supremacy, a reminder of how swiftly technological advantage can fade. And to historians, it stands as one of the clearest examples of how adaptation can change the course of history. Because the Hellcat wasn't a miracle. It was a response. It was born from study, from understanding the enemy, from absorbing every lesson paid for in blood and failure. That humility, the willingness to learn from defeat, was the true reason for its success. The human cost beneath. The wings, but for all its achievements, the Hellcat's legacy is not without sorrow. For every victory tally painted beneath its cockpit, there was another aircraft, another pilot, lost to the sea. Even in triumph, the Pacific was merciless. Hellcats crashed into the water from fuel exhaustion, disappeared into storm clouds, or landed too hard on carrier decks that shifted like living things. Many pilots never saw land again. Their last view of the world was the endless blue beneath their wings, and on the other side, thousands of young Japanese pilots, some barely trained, some barely men, died facing a machine they could not defeat. Their courage was real. Their fate was sealed. In the balance between those lives, the Hellcat remains both a marvel and a memorial. When the engines fell silent, when the last Hellcats were retired in the early 1950s, a chapter of aviation history closed. The roar of piston engines gave way to the scream of jets. The smell of oil and propellant was replaced by the heat of turbines. But something was lost in that transition, the tactile, mechanical rhythm of flight, when a pilot could feel every vibration through the stick and every gust through the frame. The Hellcat belonged to that tactile world, a world where machines and men were inseparable, and survival depended on instinct as much as innovation. When its engines finally fell silent, so did the last echo of that era. The museum Silence Today. You can find a handful of Hellcats preserved in museums, their fuselages polished, their propellers still. Children stand beneath their wings, eyes wide, while older visitors stare in quiet recognition. Veterans, if any remain, sometimes place a hand on the cool metal skin, the same surface that once shook with the thunder of battle. It's hard to imagine that this quiet artifact once commanded the skies of half the world. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The hum of its engine, the scream of its dive, the calm voice of a carrier controller guiding it home through flak and fire. The museum's silence becomes the silence of the Pacific, a silence earned through victory and paid for in blood. Lessons that endure in a century defined by rapid change, the Hellcat story endures because it carries timeless lessons. It teaches that strength is not always about elegance, that endurance often defeats brilliance, It reminds us that technology, when driven by purpose and discipline, can alter the fate of nations. And it shows that even in war, the most powerful innovations often come not from ambition, but from necessity. The Hellcat was never about perfection. It was about persistence. And in that persistence, it found greatness. From war to memory 80. Years later, the Pacific War exists only in documentaries, books, and the fading memories of the last who lived it. But its echoes remain, in the strategies that shape air combat, in the carriers that still dominate oceans, and in every fighter jet that takes off from a deck today. Each one carries the legacy of the Hellcat, a belief that the sky, though vast, can be mastered through courage, design, and resolve. The F6F didn't just win a war. It defined how wars would be fought ever after. It bridged two worlds, the romantic and the industrial, the human and the mechanical. And in doing so, it became the archetype of modern air power. Closing reflection. The end. The story of the Hellcat is not just about the machine or the men who flew it. It is about transformation. The transformation of war, the transformation of technology, and the transformation of a world learning, at terrible cost, that survival now belonged to those who could adapt fastest. For Japan, the Zero had symbolized a fleeting moment of mastery, beautiful, deadly, and doomed. For America, the Hellcat symbolized something enduring, the triumph of persistence over perfection, and together, they told the story of an age when courage met industry, and the sky became the final frontier of human conflict. The F6F Hellcat was not born to be loved. It was built to win. And in the unforgiving crucible of the Pacific, that was enough. Because when the last Zero fell burning into the sea, and the last Hellcat turned for home through the smoke and silence, the balance of the world had already changed, forever.